Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. I hope everybody is cool enough. You all have good airflow around you, glasses of water, bottles of water. I think there will be, things might heat up a little bit, but hopefully it will remain bearable. The current refugee crisis, wherever it is in the world, whatever its many causes, is possibly the greatest political and humanitarian challenge facing the world. And yet, with information filtered through fiercely partisan, often inflammatory media, and the processing of new arrivals handled by clunking, overburdened government agencies, the possibility of a clear-headed, compassionate understanding of the crisis becomes all the more faint. What, for example, distinguishes an asylum seeker from a refugee, and a refugee from a migrant? Is there a difference between an illegal alien and an undocumented immigrant, apart from the emotions each term stirs? And what happens if you're fleeing a fierce and bloody war, but no government recognises it as such? This is why Valeria Luiselli's Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions, is not just timely, but also urgent. In it, she presents an account of the treatment of undocumented children that is both deeply personal and powerfully lucid. Using the 40 questions of the intake questionnaire devised by the US Citizenship and Immigration Services as a frame, she uncovers the many failings of the system, exposes the cruelties, sometimes unintentional, sometimes not, it perpetrates, and most importantly of all, introduces us to the children themselves, reminding us that behind every statistic, every questionnaire, is a human being fundamentally no different from ourselves. Valeria Luiselli was born in Mexico City and grew up in South Africa. She's the award-winning writer of the novels The Story of My Teeth and Faces in the Crowd, and also of the highly praised essay collection Sidewalks. Her work has been translated into many languages and has appeared in publications from The New York Times, The New Yorker, Grunter, and McSweeney's. Please join me in welcoming her to Shakespeare and Company.
Thank you, Adam.
And I think we're going to begin perhaps with a little reading from Tell Me How It Ends.
Okay. Well, hi. Thanks for being here on this hot, lovely day. So, I'm going to read from a few select short fragments dispersed throughout the book. Just to give you a tiny bit of context in case you don't already have it. As Adam was saying, this book was born from the crisis that was announced as such in 2014. Although children had been arriving alone in the US for many years, in 2014 there was a sudden surge. Immigration authorities noticed that between October of 2013 and June of 2014, in that short period of time, 80,000 children had arrived alone, without parents, without anyone at the border, and were seeking asylum or some form of immigration relief. And so the crisis was declared. The crisis, it's important to say, was not declared on the basis of the situation the children found themselves, but on the basis of a kind of overflow in immigration courts and at the border and in detention facilities. When a child or when a migrant arrives in the U.S. without documents, typically they are first placed inside something called colloquially the ice box, but which is actually a facility under the care of ICE, which is the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. Therefore, the ice box, or in Spanish, it's more commonly known in Spanish as la hielera. And it's called that way because it's a very cold room, a kind of refrigerator where they keep people supposedly for a maximum of 72 hours, but during this crisis, that period extended for many days sometimes. From there, children are taken to a shelter, usually a little bit more of a humane space for them, where they are able to contact their family members and family that declares themselves as their sponsors for any kind of visa. And after that, they are sent to whichever town or city where they have this family member that will sponsor them. And only then do they receive a notice to appear, is what it's called, and it's basically an appointment at court where they will be told that they are charged with a deportation order unless they find a lawyer to defend them. Now, previous to the crisis, children had, by law, 1 year to find a lawyer to defend them. And after the crisis, the Obama administration declared the children as part of a priority docket, which basically meant that their cases were pushed up to the first priority in court, not a good priority, your priority of being deported before anyone else, unless they found a lawyer. And now, after the crisis, they only had 20 days to find a lawyer, which made it practically impossible. So a group of amazing lawyers that work for non-profit organizations got together and formulated a questionnaire that tried to screen their situations as fast as possible and find pro bono lawyers that would basically represent them. Okay, so that's the basic, the very, very basic. I'm going to read a bit from the essay that is structured around this questionnaire, the 40 questions that we ask children in court in order to determine whether they might be eligible for immigration relief through a legal representative. Why did you come to the United States? That's the first question in the intake questionnaire for unaccompanied child migrants. The questionnaire is used in the Federal Immigration Court in New York City, where I started working as a volunteer interpreter in 2015. My task there is a simple one. I interview children following the intake questionnaire and then translate their stories from Spanish into English. But nothing is ever that simple. I hear words spoken in the mouths of children, threaded in complex narratives. They are delivered with hesitance, sometimes distrust, always with fear. I have to transform them into written words, succinct sentences, and barren terms. The children's stories are always shuffled, stuttered, always shattered beyond the repair of a narrative order. The problem with trying to tell their story is that it has no beginning, no middle, and no end. The green card application is nothing like the intake questionnaire for undocumented minors. So I'm just going to read this small paragraph about the intake questionnaire as compared to the green card questionnaire, because in the process in which we were learning in the U.S. about the crisis, my family and I were awaiting immigration, our own immigration relief, which was a green card, a much easier in a way, and just an easier step, with no doubt. And we're at the same time becoming aware of what was happening in the border of our country with the U.S. The green card questionnaire is nothing like the intake questionnaire for undocumented minors. When you apply for a green card, you have to answer things like, do you intend to practice polygamy? And are you a member of the Communist Party? And have you ever knowingly committed a crime of moral turpitude? Although nothing can or should be taken lightly when you're in the fragile situation of asking for permission to live in a country that is not your own, there is something almost innocent in the green card application's preoccupations and visions of the future and its possible threats: polyamorous debauchery, communism, weak morals. The green card questionnaire has a retro kind of candor, like the grainy Cold War films we watched on VHS. The intake questionnaire for undocumented children, on the other hand, reveals a colder, more cynical and brutal reality. It reads as if it were written in high definition, and as you make your way down its 40 questions, it's impossible not to feel that the world has become a much more fucked up place than anyone could have ever imagined. So as we were driving down and waiting at the same time down to Arizona from Manhattan, and at the same time waiting for our green cards to either be rejected or given to us, we started encountering different news sources that spoke about the crisis. quite surprisingly for us, in a way that was not always, was almost never empathetic with the children's crisis or the children themselves. And for the first time, I think in a way that was direct, started, I guess, penetrating the deeper layers of the country in which we had just decided to decide to live in for an indefinite amount of time. As we drive south from southwestern New Mexico toward Arizona, it becomes more and more difficult to ignore the uncomfortable irony of it. We're traveling in the direction opposite the children whose stories we are now following so closer. As we get closer to the border and begin taking back roads, we do not see a single migrant, child or adult. We see other things, though, that indicate their ghostly presence, past or future. Along the narrow dirt road in New Mexico that goes from a ghost town called Shakespeare to another town called Animas, we see a trail of flags that volunteer groups tie to trees or fences, indicating that there are tanks filled with water there for people to drink as they cross the desert. Occasionally, we are overtaken by big pickup trucks, and it's hard not to imagine the men behind their steering wheels, big men with beards or shaved heads or abundant tattoos, vigilant, patriotic men who carry pistols and rifles by constitutional right and feel entitled to use them if they see a group of aliens walking in the desert. As we approach Animas, we also begin to see fleeting herds of border patrol cars like ominous white stallions racing toward the horizon. We decide not to tell anyone in diners and gas stations that we're Mexican just in case. But we are stopped a few times by Border Patrol officials and have to show our passports and display big smiles when we explain we are just riders and just on vacation. We have to confirm that yes, we are only riders, even if yes, we are also Mexican. Why are we there and what are we riding, they always want to know. We are riding a Western, sir. That's what we tell them, that we're riding a Western. We also tell them that we came to Arizona for the open skies and the silence and the emptiness. The second part more true than the part about riding the Western, which is untrue. Handing back our passports, one official says sardonically, "So you come all the way down here for the inspiration?" We know better than to contradict anyone who carries a badge and a gun, so we just say, "Yes, sir." Because how do you explain that it's never inspiration that drives you to tell a story, but rather a combination of anger and clarity? How do you say, no, we don't find inspiration here, but we find a country that is as beautiful as it is broken, and we are somehow now part of it, so we are also broken with it, and feel ashamed, confused, and sometimes hopeless, and are trying to figure out how to do something about all that. And finally, I'm just going to read to you a small fragment of an interview, of an actual interview in court with two very small girls. Often my daughter asks me, "So how does the story of those children end?" "I don't know how it ends yet," I usually say. My daughter often follows up on the story she half hears. There's one story that obsesses her, a story I only tell her in pieces and for which I have not yet been able to offer a real ending. It begins with two girls in the courtroom. They are 5 and 7 years old, and they're from a small village in Guatemala. Spanish is their second language, but the older girl speaks it well. We sit around the mahogany table in the room where the interviews take place, and their mother observes from one of the benches in the back. The little girl concentrates on her coloring book, a crayon in her right hand. The older one has her hands crossed as an adult might, and she answers my questions one by one. She's a little shy, but tries to be clear and precise in her answers, delivering all of them with a big smile, toothless here and there. "Why did you come to the United States?" "I don't know." "How did you travel here?" "A man brought us." "A coyote?" "No, a man." "Was he nice to you?" "Yes, he was nice, I think." "And where did you cross the border?" I don't know. Texas? Arizona? Yes, Texas, Arizona. I realize it's impossible to go on with the interview, so I ask the lawyers to make an exception and allow the mother to meet with us, at least for a while. Parents are usually not allowed to be in the interview in case the children feel that they can't speak freely. I realize it's impossible to go on with the interview, so I ask the lawyers to make an exception and allow the mother to meet with us, at least for a while. We go back to question 1, and the mother responds for the girls, filling holes, explaining things, and also telling her own version of the story. When the younger of the daughters turned 2, she decided to migrate north and left them in the care of their grandmother. She crossed 2 national borders with no documents. She wasn't detained by Border Patrol and managed to cross the desert with a group of people. After a few weeks, she arrived in Long Island, where she had a cousin. That's where she settled. Years passed, and the girls grew up. Years passed, and she remarried. She had another child. One day, she called her mother, the grandmother of the girls, and told her that the time had come. She had saved enough money to bring the girls over. I don't know how the grandmother responded to the news of her granddaughter's imminent departure, but she noted the instructions down carefully and later explained them to the girls. In a few days, a man was going to come for them, a man who would help them get back to their mother. She told them that it would be a long trip, but that he would keep them safe. The man had already taken other girls from their village safely across the 2 borders to their mothers, and everything had gone well, so everything would go well this time too. The day before they left, their grandmother sewed a 10-digit telephone number on the collars of the dress each child would wear throughout the entire trip. It was a 10-digit number the girls had not been able to memorize, as hard as she tried to get them to. So she had decided to embroider it on their dresses and repeat over and over a single instruction. They should never take this dress off, not even to sleep. And as soon as they reached America, as soon as they met the first American policeman, they were to show the inside of the dress's collar to him. He would then dial the number and let them speak to their mother. The rest would follow. The rest did follow. They made it to the border, were kept in custody in the hielera for an indefinite period of time. After that, they were sent to a shelter, and a few weeks later, they were put on a plane and flown to JFK, where their mother, baby brother, and stepfather were waiting for them. That's it? My daughter asks. That's it, I tell her. That's how it ends? Yes, that's how it ends. But of course it doesn't end there. That's just where it begins, with a court summons, the first notice to appear. Okay.
Thank you so much. I guess the first thing I'd like to ask is about what made you take on this role as an interpreter, because I can imagine as a writer, a lot of writers have been struck by injustices or situations that they found intolerable, and the immediate response would be, okay, I will research this and I'll write about it and I'll tell people about it. And of course you have done this with the book, but there was a step towards that. I mean, you went in to do something practical, which wasn't necessarily going to lead to any sort of piece of writing. So I was just wondering what motivated you to do that rather than approach it as perhaps we might expect a writer to.
Well, the short answer is Freeman wouldn't stop writing emails to me saying you have to write about this. Okay. But the longer answer is, indeed, I had worked in court for a year and a half or so, or maybe a year, and I didn't want to write about the situation that was going on in court, basically because I did not have enough clarity. I did not have enough emotional clarity to write about it. I think I was still filled with just anger and frustration. And because I didn't have enough clarity about the immigration system, it's a really hard labyrinth to navigate, and I wouldn't have been able to write responsibly about it until much later, when I had studied the law enough and then spoken to enough lawyers and been in training sessions and dinners with lawyers and meetings. Only after all of that I started to have a bit of a clearer idea. And then there was a period, because I didn't get my green card, the rest of my family did, but I have very bad luck with airplanes, with papers, with everything. I think I maybe told you once, Adam, once I applied for a tax exemption. I think I told you, well, you saw this, Laurence. My agency asks for this document that's like a double taxation exemption something, and I applied for them, and instead of getting those for me, I got Richard Gere's. Which is so, I mean, you have to be very unlucky, because, I mean, imagine if you end up paying taxes for Richard Gere. No? So despite the fact that my mother thought it was a very lucky opportunity to maybe meet Richard Gere, it wasn't. And with a green card, what happened was that it just didn't arrive. It didn't arrive. My family's green cards arrived, and I waited for about 2 years. I had to send congressional petitions, letters to the Democrats so that they would maybe pressure the people in Texas. And only after 2 years I got it. And there was a period in that moment where I had to stop working because my employment something expired, and I had to stop. I teach in the university, and I couldn't teach in that period. I had to just sit at home and basically do nothing or do something. And at that time, I started to study the immigration law with more time, with more seriousness, and finally decided that it was time to write this piece. It was like that, I guess.
And when you first started doing the interpretation and the translation with this 40-question questionnaire, what were your feelings when you first saw the questionnaire? Because in a way, a questionnaire, at least when I think of it seems such a banal, such an inoffensive thing. And in fact, many of the questions, if you don't give them a lot of thought, seem like just general questions. It's unsurprising that the information should be required. And yet it seems in reading the book that, in fact, each of these questions, with each of these questions, you have to navigate so many sensitivities, so many personal stories. Yeah. Did that come as a surprise to you?
Well, you have to navigate many layers of trauma, and if you're not a psychologist, for example, you don't know how to deal with wounds that are very recent. So it's very important to be careful about what you ask, and especially how much you deviate from the questionnaire. Like there's a question in the questionnaire which is about what happened, if anything happened in their journey toward the United States. And it's not a very relevant question to the children in the sense that it doesn't really necessarily lead to answers that can make them eligible for asylum in the U.S. because whatever happened in the middle happened in Mexico. And I am Mexican, and it's the question that is most difficult for me to ask, and sometimes I want to ask more because I want to know what happens in my country, where all we know is that there's more than 150,000 disappeared Central Americans who may be dead or may be enslaved in poppy fields growing poppy for heroin production, children that are kidnapped, and it's just an atrocious panorama. So sometimes I want to know, but I don't want to know at the same time, and especially it's not pertinent for the children's asylum cases, so I stop there. But in terms of the other questions that you say are sometimes yes, banal questions that are that seem like sort of the normal thing to ask in that situation. What's important is, especially if you're not a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, you have to ask everything and take note of everything, because you never know what a child may say that a lawyer sees as an opportunity to help that child, right? Now, the first time I saw the questionnaire, I thought it was a cold piece of officialness. I was kind of angry at it. And it took me a while to understand that indeed it was really the only route And it's not an official questionnaire in the sense that it's not a government-produced questionnaire meant to make people feel like they are aliens and terrorists and everything that the really official ones make you feel. This is something put together by a group of lawyers, immigration lawyers, who want to help children achieve some form of immigration relief.
And in a way, I guess it's designed to try and get, and you talk about this, the so-called correct answers, because that's something which must be very hard when you're confronted with these children and you're asking them the questions. Is that what could be a so-called good thing for them to say? How does that feel? Do you have a sense of you want to sort of lead them towards the correct answers? Do you have to remain sort of stoic and neutral in a situation like that?
No, not stoic and neutral, in the sense that at the end you're having a conversation with a child, right? So it's on the contrary about, I mean, the way I see my role there is about creating a space that feels safe for a child to say things. But it's true that, and this is something I was told when I was being trained to do these interviews. I was told this by a very, very good immigration lawyer, who told me, well, the paradox of this immigration system is that you want to hear the worst possible story, because the way that things work is, if the person has really undergone extreme cases of violence, abuse, persecution, and can sometimes show them with physical scars, things like that, then immediately immigration law sees them as subjects to be protected. But if not, and that's the case of these two girls that I read about, if two girls can't tell you their story because they're too young to articulate it, or they don't know that what they've gone through up until they're 7 years of age is a form of abuse or neglect or ban, if they just don't know, it's impossible to find a correct answer. And the most probable scenario is that they would get deported, because they can't fabricate the story. And of course, as an interpreter, screener, translator in court, you want to tip the scale in their favor, but it's not something you can do, because even if you do, they will go through many other instances of questioning by a judge, and there's just no way that you can fabricate. So it's not a good idea.
And yet there are instances where yeah, we're good. There are instances where you feel you have to rephrase the question 2 or 3 times for the child to be able to understand what you're getting at as well, and it does underline, I think, a little bit the way that these forms were maybe designed by adults without really an idea of how children are able to express themselves and what sort of language they might understand. And it's interesting at one moment, you rephrase a question 2 or 3 times, and then you get the answer that the child would have given had they understood the question from the start. Something you say as well is that there's this sort of, when you're talking to the children, there's this sort of grim predictability to the stories that you're going to hear, this sort of this familiarity, this sort of repetition, and yet at the same time you're never prepared for the impact each of the child's stories is going to have on you. Would you be able to just talk a little bit about the sort of the emotional impact working as an interpreter and meeting all these children, the effect it had on you?
Well, I mean, as any human being, there's especially when first confronted by the realities of people who have really gone through hell, there's instances of incredible frustration, and especially when you're not a lawyer. I've been wanting to start a career in law, but my family doesn't let me because They said we've gone through enough years of poverty for you to start another another career now. My daughter's like, no, you're a writer, just stay to do that. But it's frustrating as a citizen in today's USA. Today's world, right? But maybe now, particularly in today's USA, where I see the incredible work that lawyers are doing through organizations like the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Association, and the little that one can do in their own field. The only thing I can do is interpret at court and maybe write a book that maybe, if read by the right people, might change the way that immigration is spoken about in media. The idea that the children are called illegal, where that idea is completely nonsensical. That is, how can a person be illegal? You can do something illegal, but you cannot be illegal, right? But that's the word used in the media. Or the fact that children, this group of children, this large group of children that have arrived, are called migrants, which is in a way true, but that's also a way of that the government washes their hands and doesn't really get involved in their responsibility, in their political, social responsibility with those children who are entitled to asylum, right? So if they're not called refugees, if that word doesn't spread, if they're kept as just migrants, it's easier to not get involved. So there's a lot of frustration, as I was saying, but I guess there's also a lot to do. And something that changed the way I envisaged the work that I was doing, especially when I began writing, was something that a good friend of mine told me, a friend of mine who has worked in situations of civil wars, and she said, listen, your feelings don't matter in this case, and I agree. What matters is that you are able to turn all that emotional capital in everything you accumulate while talking to people and turn it into political capital by writing something that makes a small change. And I think that idea helped me a lot to understand that to put things in their right dimension.
And I think for me the underlying power of the book, and I think what sets it aside from a lot of I suppose particularly journalism about the refugee crisis, is the individual stories that we hear. Because it made me think when I was reading that actually generally the stories of migrants are told in a very general way. Mm-hmm. So we will see pictures, perhaps photos of individual migrants, but then it will be told in sort of groups of people on a boat, or the number of people that arrived on a particular island, or there's a certain percentage of a town which has disappeared to migrate, and it made me realize that when we talk about things in groups and in numbers and statistics, it's not particularly easy to relate to it. Yeah. And one thing that struck me is because you focus on particular cases, there is not only a power to it, but there's also a real empathy that we are able to have, which perhaps we're not able to have when newspapers or journalists report in very general terms. Was that was that important for you to tell these individual stories, even though you don't name any of the children? Was it important to to demarcate between each individual story rather than saying this happens in general?
Well, yeah, I was on the fence for a while. I didn't know how to do it because I didn't want to put any of the children that I had worked with in danger in terms of their story or something being recognizable. And in fact, one of them that I speak about more here, whom I call Manu in the story, is a teenager that I still see every week, at least, because he forms part of an organization that my students put together as a response to all of this. And he was really upset with me that I didn't put his name. And he was like, he would write me WhatsApp messages like, Valeria, but you can't put my name. Like it's just my first name. And his lawyer was like, no, he still doesn't have a green card. He cannot be identifiable. And then I said, well, maybe I can put a picture of you. And then I found a picture that he sent of this video where he's making like gymnastics, like he's turning in the air, and you can't see his face, just his body in the air. And he was like, well, you can't see my face, or what for, right? So there's that, and I couldn't personalize this book to that degree. And I also didn't want to write a compendium of testimonies. I wanted this book to be at the same time a kind of X-ray of immigration law and the immigration system, and a political essay that gave some historical background for what is happening, because that's the other important thing, right? This crisis seems to come out of nowhere, and if at all, it is explained as an exodus of people who are fleeing gang violence in Central America, and that is thought of as a local problem in Central America, and not as a problem that has its roots in the US, in fact. Right? When the Reagan administration funded the Salvadoran military government, who then started massacring the population, and the population had to flee, and a lot of them were taken in as refugees in the US. And those who arrived in gang-ridden LA in the 80s formed the MS-13, which is now there's the gang that is basically expelling, one of the gangs that is expelling these children. And no one remembers that. No one remembers that the MS is a Los Angeles gang, and that was later deported. And when they were deported, they spread. They had it was like a metastasis of a cancer instead of an eradication, right? And now the MS-13 is everywhere in the U.S. They're in the town where I teach. They're in L.A., of course. They're in Mexico. They joined the Sinaloa cartel, and there are, of course, a lot of them back in Central America. So now it's a transnational army with more than 70,000 members who are involved in some of the most violent practices today, right?
You say that people don't remember that. Is it perhaps more a case of people don't want to remember that it's inconvenient to remember that if governments remember it, then they have to take responsibility for it, and they have to act. Right.
I mean, it's that, and the Mexican government, the U.S. government, and the governments of the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, are co-responsible for this situation, and until those governments accept their shared responsibility, historical and current, there's no way that there can be a solution, a real long-lasting solution.
And do you think the lack of political will, because it would involve sort of financial commitment and things like that? Or?
It's that, and I think there's an enormous racial factor. Mm-hmm. I think that if the children were white, they might be accepted in a much easier way. Mm-hmm. There's an usually unspoken racial component to not allowing certain migrant populations, and I say this for the case of the U.S. as much as of Mexico. Mexico has accepted to a certain degree refugees from Central America in the past, but really Mexico has always been very proud of being a country that has accepted exiles. But the exiles have been from Europe and Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and with Central America, Mexico has behaved always just like a monster, right? There hasn't, and now with Haitians trying to flee Haiti and coming in through Mexico to maybe get to the United States, it's the same thing, right? So I think that one of the components is certainly racial.
And likewise, at a moment, you say that one of the difficulties in the US is that the way that the situation is described is always as their problem. So the children that arrive, it's not a result of this, as you say, this sort of this transnational situation, but as something that's going on elsewhere, and sending essentially the children into the States.
The sort of the barbaric South, right? That we have to contain with a wall, because if not, they're going to flood us with their drugs and their brownness and their everythingness, and as if that were possible, first of all, as if there wasn't a not only a deep historical shared responsibility, but a current one too. I mean, the drug wars, the current drug wars in Mexico are tied to the U.S. The money, the drugs are bought in the U.S. The guns come, the drugs come into Mexico from the U.S. The drugs come back to the U.S. from Mexico. There's offer and demand. It's quite simple, right?
And the actual the process. I'd be interested to talk about the process of writing the book itself and the reasons specifically behind it. Because in the introduction, John Lee Anderson says, there's no answers, only more questions. And it's funny because when obviously the title is not an essay in 40 answers, it's an essay in 40 questions. And indeed, would that there were only 40 questions that we're left with at the end, because in a way, it's I found it a very emotionally effective book, a very educational book on the sort of the situation with migrants in the Americas, which I was not particularly familiar with before. But in addition, it did leave me with lots of questions about what can be done. Was it a desire to sort of create that dialogue that made you write the book, like to set out the situation, to show how things are, and then sort of leave it open for discussion as to potential solutions or responses?
Well, yes, definitely, but I think it's also important to stress what you said earlier about the question about what can be done, because I think that's a question that a lot of us are posing, especially now with sort of the sort of right-wing governments taking over or almost taking over in the case of France. Luckily, France still stands. But that's, I guess, the question that has been on everyone's mind for a long time. And I was truly inspired by my students. I teach in a university in Long Island in Hempstead, which is this town that's also ridden by gangs. And it's not the demographics of the university are pretty mixed, not entirely, but the students that I teach are mostly of Hispanic backgrounds or of immigrant backgrounds of any origin. And I started teaching them a course that was supposed to be, it was a really boring course called Advanced Conversation in Spanish. Imagine that. And I thought, what am I going to talk about with these kids with 10 students for an entire semester? I have to come up with conversation. And I was already working in court, and I was very much obsessed with this. So I started talking about migration the first day, and I saw that they looked interested. And then I told them at the end of the session, well, write to me if you are interested in talking about this issue the entire semester. And the 10 of them wrote to me, and they said, yes, we want to. And after some weeks, they started calling themselves the migration think tank. And one day I arrived in class, and they said, Prof, we want to make an organization. We want to do something. We want to stop talking about all your theories, and we want to actually do something. And they formed an organization. So that was happening, and that kept on happening. The organization kept growing and becoming more solid. First, just a plan that we had, and we drafted a constitution. Then it became more and more solid, and now we're a small organization, but we work very hard in our area, and particularly with teenage migrants. Some of them that are in particular danger of falling into gang activity and gang violence again, right? And so my students teach them English, which is the first important thing for an integration process. But then some of my more political students hold discussion sessions about civil rights and violence and gender thinking. I think what they're thinking about is sort of politicizing them also, these teenagers, so that they too can in their communities become more active and feel that they have rights and they can do something about the situation. Of course, all of this is happening while the Trump administration is raiding homes where women are being let go from detention, but with ankle bracelets with GPS systems to locate them. So things have gotten much worse than when I was writing this book. So I don't know.
I think that's it. And I've got one more thing I'd just like to talk about that before opening up to questions for the audience. So if you have a question for Valeria, get ready and we'll get a microphone to you in a moment. But just on the subject of your students' organisation, and I think it was one of the moments in the book that really captured the sort of the positive effect that this kind of book and this kind of discussion can have, is when I think there'd been maybe football, a soccer match or something like that, and one of them had given one of the migrant children a lift home and said to you something along the lines of, I can't believe, like, a few months ago we were just talking about them and now one of these people is in my car. And this sort of moving from just theory and ideas and having it as sort of a detached thing to having met one of these, or several of these migrants, having sort of developed a relationship. I thought it was a sort of incredibly touching moment.
Well, that's what it's about, right? I think many times the problem is that things like this are conceived as assistance or help, helping the immigrant community, and it's not about going over and helping with your enormous capacity to save the world. It's about finding forms of real integration, right? And I feel that my students help the teenagers that they work with as much as vice versa. I know the teenagers that they're working with teach them Spanish. They go, I don't know, they're one is teaching the other how to skateboard properly because he kind of sucks at it, and that's how really communities interact in a much more organic way. I had the same boy that I talk about here, Manu. I don't tell this in the book because this is much more recent. Now has begun to write hip hop songs about his experiences and I have two students who are studying to be radio people, right? And they've started recording with him, and so they have this project going on where they record him and he sings for them, and they've recorded a long radio episode. So I mean, I think that's that's much more valuable when teenagers and kids who are just a little bit older than them are kind of urging them on, and probably hopefully a lot of those teenagers will then be able to apply to college, and it won't be like a distant reality for them, right? Yeah.
Okay, does anybody have a question? Yes, we have one right at the front here.
Thank you for coming in your interview. I have two. The first question is, I'm from California, and I've come across survivors of sex trafficking, and I'm wondering if you could talk about whether any of your investigation led you into this area of trauma for individuals, and also I'm really struck by the title of your book, Tell Me How It Ends, and I wondered if you could talk about how you chose that part of your title.
Yeah, sure. Well, I chose that title because it was just something that my daughter kept on asking me, right? She's 7 years old, so she hears, sometimes I'd maybe tell my husband, something that happened in court that day, and then she would always ask for him, but so what about those children, and what's happening, and then what happened, but tell me how it ends. And so I stole it from her. And about your first question, no, and I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not trained to deal with that kind of deeper discussion. So when there is when I interview girls in court, young women or girls, and they do say that they have had an experience of sexual trauma, and most of them have, 8 out of 10 girls or older women get raped 8 out of 10. Imagine that, on their way across Mexico. So much so that many of them take contraceptive precautions before they begin the journey, in order not to get pregnant in the journey. But when they do say that, I note it down, and I don't ask further, because there are people that will later on in sort of in this chain of that the non-profits have set up, that will be able to talk to them. People that really do know how to handle something like that. I just make a note and go to the next question. I don't dig deep.
Thank you. I also have two questions. First of all, what proportion...
As long as you don't have 40.
Well,
okay.
I probably do if I can get going. What percentage of the children that you've worked with have been deported? Mm-hmm. And when they are deported, does the United States government make sure that there is someone there to receive them? Mm-hmm. Are they just stuck on a plane? Mm-hmm. And has it been determined that they will not be in danger when they get back?
Well, most likely they will be in danger when they get back, because they fled because of that danger. That I know of, none of the kids that I've interviewed in court have been deported, but I don't have a follow-up of every single one. I follow up with a few cases where I was asked to continue to be a child's translator after court, when they actually have a lawyer and maybe have a pro bono lawyer that doesn't speak Spanish, and then they need a translator to go through with the rest of the process. But the good news somehow is that, beyond my experience, it is to a degree known that about 98% of the children that find a lawyer find a way to stay. The big thing, again, is lawyers. So if you don't know what to study, or if you already studied, study law, because that's really the only way. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions? Don't appreciate. Oh yeah, just over there.
Hi. So you say in the essay that the only way to grant any justice is by hearing and recording these stories over and over again, so that they come back always to haunt and shame us. But I've heard a lot of people push back against that idea, that like it causes compassion fatigue to do that kind of repetition of stories, and that it becomes exploitative to use these heartbreaking stories over and over again, especially as journalists do, in a way for our own gain. So how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, nothing disappoints me more than when someone says, "Oh, your book is so heartbreaking," because it's not about liberal compassion. It's not about like the very self-congratulatory capacity to feel empathy for someone. It's not about that. It's about overstepping the state of ignorance in which most people live with respect to historical crises, political processes. So I do think that this story has to be written over and over, not in a way that is, oh, how heartbreaking, or not in tweets, not in Facebook posts, because that, I mean, it's fine to do that, but that doesn't necessarily lead, or maybe it leads to, as you said, to compassion fatigue. But we do need the journalists doing the work, because they do go out there and they report. They ride the train that the migrants ride, and they document what happens. And if we know anything about what happened there, it's because of the work of journalists. We need writers writing about it, because they can maybe write in a way that goes beyond the initial sort of photograph that we get from journalists. We need political scientists thinking about it in a more layered and complex way. So I do think that it's important to add voices, but that doesn't mean the same thing as the sort of internet noise that does often cloud things.
On which note, I'm afraid we're out of time. Okay, there was one woman who looked very disappointed down there. So, okay, two. We'll take those two more questions, three, but very quickly in that case. Okay. So
yes, so quickly, I don't know if I'm quoting you correctly. You spoke about America, this beautiful and broken country, and I'm thinking about your work as an interpreter, and you mentioned that obviously there are many things you cannot say. You're an interpreter. But can you speak about some things that you wished you could say to the children, about America, and maybe also to yourself before you came, like things that you would have liked to have told yourself, also before becoming a writer? Yes.
I mean, I think that what I would like to say to children, and what I maybe didn't say in the first cases because I was still learning how to conduct the interviews, and is a very basic question, which is like, what do you need? What is the thing you most need right now, or what are the things you most need right now, right? When we started discussing with my students how we were going to run the organization that we run in the university, we first had a lot of plans, and then thought, well, maybe they don't want what we're planning, right? So what we started doing was just asking, what do you want? What do you need? And then teenagers said English. They said soccer. Definitely soccer. So now part of the fundamental part of the organization has become soccer games, and it's pretty cool actually, because there's a lot of really good professional soccer players that play for the team, and some of them have joined the organization, and some of them just show up for the games, and they're kind of like gods for right. They're like real soccer players, soon to be maybe bought by a real team, and some people have said, and we haven't really managed to do this yet, like to be able to have sort of art classes and sort of other skills, right? But at the moment we're starting, so it's really English and soccer.
No, there was a lady over there, and that will be our final one.
Hi, yeah, I'm wondering, so kind of when you sit down to write something, what you think is going to come out ends up really changing along the way. And I'm wondering if you had any unexpected things that you found during your writing process that you could share. I initially wrote this in English. There was a shorter version that came out in Freeman's Journal. And then I gave it to my editors in Mexico so they could maybe find a magazine or some place to publish it there. And they said, no, we would actually like to publish it as a book. Oh, so I said, okay, great, go ahead, find a good translator. And then they said, no, you're going to translate it. And I said, no, I'm not going to translate it. And then we went to dinner, which was supposed to be a very civilized dinner, but it ended up being, they gave me 5 tequilas and made me sign a serviette saying that I will self-translate everything that I dare write in the language of the empire into Spanish, because it's a betrayal to my mother tongue. So I was convinced that they were right about this. After 5 tequilas, and my mother probably hates me. And so and they were right. I rewrote it into Spanish, and it was very unexpected what happened when I rewrote it into Spanish, because an entire dimension of this problem didn't open up itself to me for the first time, but I had to deal with it. I couldn't ignore it. When I wrote this in English, I only focused on what happens in the US and fundamentally in court. And when I wrote it in Spanish, I had to talk about what happens in Mexico. It's unfortunate that there's very little information. There's bits and pieces, but there's less. I would have liked to have more numbers, more things to document the Mexican layers that I added, and those layers added
through Spanish, because I had to face that monster, came into the book version in English. So this is maybe twice as long as the original essay, because it included that, but coming to terms with that.
Well, we don't have any tequila, but we do have wine, so do stick around in the conversation.
No tequila, ever.
The conversation can continue. I think I hope it's come across quite how affecting and quite how important I think the book is, and I really do urge you to read it. I'm sure Valeria would be happy to sign copies for you too. As I say, do stick around, have a glass of wine with us, continue the conversation, and just one more time, please give it up for Valeria Luiselli.